Welcome to the very first episode of Good and Bad Days. I'm your host, Calvin Mackey. When I first had the idea for this podcast a couple of years ago, I planned to talk about some of the issues surrounding living with an autoimmune disease. As most of you know, I have MS, and I've been battling MS now for about 15 years. And it can lead to some very challenging days, good and bad days. But it's interesting how in an instant that phrase can take on a whole new meaning. Today I'm going to be real with you. I'm going to open up my heart and let you into one of the most painful experiences of my life. I lost my son, and it's been just over a year since I got that call, the one that no parent should ever have to receive, the call that changed everything for me. It was April 29th, 2023, and I'll never forget that day. It was like the earth shifted beneath my feet. Have you ever had a moment where time seemed to stand still, where everything that made sense suddenly did not make any sense anymore? That's where I found myself when I lost my son. I remember getting the call early that morning, about 6 a.m. I was on my way to South Carolina, and I had just left my house, so I hadn't really gotten on a highway yet. Actually, I'm just about to get on the highway and I'm sitting at a stoplight. The phone rang and I looked over at the caller ID and I see it says Waterbury Police Department. I never seen that on my caller ID before, and my first thought was, why would the police be calling me this early in the morning? Strangely enough, Calvin came to my mind. I remember thinking, what did he do now? Maybe he got pulled over, didn't have his insurance card or something. But I answered the call, unsure what was coming. And an officer on the other end asks, is this Calvin Mackey Sr.? And I swear, as soon as he said senior, my heart sank. I knew it had something to do with my son. Trying to keep my composure, I just replied, yeah, this is Calvin Mackey Sr. And then the officer said the words no parent should ever have to hear. He said, Mr. Mackey, your son was in a car accident last night. I'm afraid to tell you that he didn't make it. When he said it, those words hit me, but they didn't really register at first. It was like my brain couldn't fully process them. Just 8 hours before that, Calvin was standing at the foot of my bed, asking me which shirt he should wear when he was going out that night. And now I'm hearing this person tell me he's gone. Officer kept talking, but I couldn't focus. He was using phrases like he didn't make it. It just didn't seem real. I remember thinking, is this a joke? Someone playing a prank on me? But the officer's voice was steady. He said, no, Mr. Mackey, your son was in an accident and he didn't survive. I realized at that moment I was sitting at the traffic light, frozen. Luckily, there weren't any other cars on the road that morning because it was so early. But I noticed the light had turned green and back to red. So I pulled into the gas station that was right there on the corner. I needed to gather myself. I sat for a few seconds trying to get my composure so I could drive. And my mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. I started asking questions even though I wasn't sure I wanted the answers. So I asked the officer, I said, where is he? I asked him, where's my son? This officer, in what felt like a cold, detached tone, says to me that the other people in the car that he hit had survived and were on their way to the hospital, just in case you were wondering. He said it as if I should be grateful for that, as if I hadn't just lost the most important person in my world. It wasn't the time for me to process anything at that moment beyond my son. So his words kind of stung, like he was questioning my empathy, as if I hadn't even had the time to grieve before being asked to care about the others. I didn't care about his tone. I just kept asking, where's my son? I need to see my son. He replied, the body is with the coroner right now and they're doing their job. And the word body, it hit me like a punch in the gut. My son wasn't the body. He was Calvin. I was having to listen to someone talk about him like he was just remains. I kept insisting, I need to see him. Don't I need to identify him? An officer said, you'll be able to see the body when the mortician is finished. The words, the body, kept ringing in my ears. The body. The body. I wasn't asking about a body. I was asking about my son. But in that moment, I had to come to terms with the fact that my son was now part of a process. He wasn't Calvin anymore. He was, for all those involved, the body. It was the most devastating realization of my life, and all I wanted was to see him. But everything now was about the processes, procedures, the funeral home, the arrangements, that I wasn't ready for anything. I finally made it back home, back to the house, and I pulled into the garage. I guess Tanika must have heard the garage door open, and I sat in my car for a few minutes. Because right there in that moment, I knew that once I stepped out of this car, I'd have to say it out loud again. And then it would be real. Everything that had just happened in that conversation would no longer but just be in my head. Those words would not be just echoing in that car. It would be out in the world. I got out the car and I went to step on the ground, and I felt as if I couldn't feel the ground beneath me. I walked over to the door, and Tanika had already opened it. She was wondering why I was back home so soon. And as soon as she saw me, I just collapsed in her arms, crying. She kept asking, what happened? What happened? What's wrong? I knew I had to say it, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to make it real. But I looked at her and I said, Calvin's gone. She looked at me, confused. What do you mean Calvin's gone? Where'd he go? I had to say, no, he's gone. He died. He was in a car accident last night. Police just called me and said that he didn't survive. As I was trying to process it all, Jaden came down the stairs. She looked at her mother and asked her, well, what's wrong? Tanika kind of mouthed it to her. Calvin was in an accident. I mean, I couldn't bear to look at their faces at this point. I didn't want to see what their expressions were. So Tanika walked me to the den and sat me on the couch. And I just couldn't stop crying. In that moment, I didn't know it, but I was entering the first stages of grief. But I didn't have time to truly grieve, because the next thing that came to my mind was, how do I tell the rest of my children? I knew I couldn't let them find out the way I did. I didn't want them to hear it on the news or from somebody else, or them getting a random phone call. I couldn't just let someone call them and say, your brother is gone. So I called their mother, wanting to make sure that they were told in a way that would help them process it and not shatter them. It was about 6:30 in the morning when I made that call, and I didn't want to catch them off guard, but I also didn't want them to hear it from somebody else. I called their mother again because she didn't answer the first time. I knew it was early. She was probably wondering why I was calling so early, but I needed to tell her what had happened. She answered. I said, I'm sorry to call so early, but something happened last night. Calvin was in a car accident, and he didn't make it. I don't remember too much of her response. She was in shock, of course, like anyone would be. And I asked her if it was possible she could tell the girls in person to be with them when they heard the news. She said she would, and I thanked her before hanging up. And I had to do it all over again. I called Jamie's mother so that she could tell her. Shock, just as overwhelming. But she promised to talk to her. I mean, I knew I could call my son Ray directly and give him the news. and he would take it differently. So then I called him. Mind you, this was all still within the first hour after receiving the call. I was still processing the loss myself, but I had to keep going. I had to make sure my children knew, make sure somebody could be there to hold them when they heard the news. In the days that followed, I don't even remember them clearly. I was existing but not living. People would come by, they'd say, "I'm sorry for your loss." And while I knew they meant well, there were no words that could touch the depth of what I was feeling. There was no comfort for this kind of pain. I remember having to go to my neurologist maybe about 3 weeks after the accident. And when you get to the doctor's office, of course, you sit out front and they call you back. And the nurse called my name, all of this. I'm still like moving, but not moving, operating, but not operating. So I get back to the room and the nurse goes through all of her progressions, temperature, blood pressure. They ask you a series of questions. And because of the MS, one of the questions that they always ask me is, "Are you in any pain today?" I didn't want to say I woke up in tears and I didn't think that I could get it out. I didn't think I'd get out of bed because I knew it wasn't because of the MS. I didn't want to say I didn't think I could get out of my car when I pulled in because I couldn't stop crying, because again, that wasn't about the MS. She was asking me about the MS. But I'm sure she didn't understand the gravity of the question she had just asked me, because she had no idea what I was dealing with. What struck me even more was that out of all the people I had encountered since the accident, those that came to my house, the friends and family at the service, those who called to offer condolences or check on me, this was the first person that asked me, "Are you in any pain today?" She asked me again, and I remember telling her I was at about a 5 that day, and she put in her notes. Told me the doctor would be in. She wished me a nice day, and she walked out of the office and closed the door. At that point, I wanted to break down, but I had to remember where I was, because I didn't need them confusing one pain for another. But that is what your days become. One of the hardest questions I've always had trouble with, that people would ask me, whether it was asked in reference to my physical health or recently Calvin's death, was, "How are you? How are you doing?" Everyone that I encountered, how are you? I know that may seem strange, and I know people mean well, but it's always the hardest question to answer. And in this moment, at this point in time, I didn't know how to answer. I mean, I don't like to wear my emotions on my sleeve, so responding with something like, "I'm in immense pain today," or "I feel like I'm about to break down at any minute." None of that stuff is anything you want to talk about. So you practice your responses, and they're mostly, "I'm good," or one of those, "I'm taking it one day at a time." Whatever could get me past that moment without having to really get into the true depths of where I am right now. At some point, you realize you're becoming one of the people you could never understand when you would hear them say something or see them post certain things. To be honest, I would see people who had lost someone and they would say stuff like, "I think about you every day," or "Not a moment goes by that you're on my mind." And I never could grasp how that was even possible. I mean, you think about them every day. I mean, I had lost people before, friends, family, loved ones, and I've mourned their loss. And I was hurt because of their absence. But this was different. This wasn't just loss, this was devastation. It's not until you understand that level of grief that you could ever understand how that is possible. This was a piece of my soul being ripped away, and there was nothing I could do about it. It's one thing to mourn someone, but to miss them, true grief. True grief is something that grabs you by the throat and won't let go. It's the kind of pain that sits in your chest, heavy like a weight that refuses to be lifted. I mean, I was in a fog all the time. I was numb. I went through emotions because, let's be honest, that's all you can do when you're in that place. You don't have the strength to be strong. You don't have the energy to be anything but broken. In those moments, I realized grief is not something you ever get over. It was something I was learning how to live with. But I'll tell you something about grief. It's not polite. It's not quiet. Grief doesn't come in and ask for permission to disrupt your life. It bulldozes through the door and leaves you in shambles. I learned that grief comes in waves. Some days it's a gentle reminder of the love you had, and other days it's like being caught in a storm, tossed and turned, unable to find your footing. Some days I thought I was okay. I would get up, I would move through the day, I would think maybe I'm getting better. But then out of nowhere, a memory would hit, or I'd see something that reminded me of him, and I'd be right back at the beginning. Grief doesn't care about your timeline. It doesn't care about how much you've healed. It shows up when it wants to, and you have no choice but to face it. I had never known true grief until I lost my son. It's a kind of pain that isolates you, that makes you feel like no one understands. And honestly, not everyone does. Some people don't know how to be there for you. They don't know how to sit with your pain. And as time goes on, people move on. But I was still standing here, holding the weight of this loss, unsure of how to carry it. I remember being in a dark place. I was angry with God. I remember asking him, is this really part of your plan? Of all the people you had to take right now, you had to choose him? Then it became very selfish. Why would you do this to me? Why me? Why now? But when I got off my soapbox, God had to show me in this dark season of my life that grief is not just about pain. He showed me that it's about love. It's a reflection of the depth of the love we carry for the person we've lost. Grief speaks to the bond that remains even in their absence. It's the heart's way of holding on to love when there's no longer physical presence to pour it into. Grief is a reminder that love doesn't simply disappear when someone is gone. Instead, it transforms, shifting from shared moments and conversations to memories, aching in the silence that they've left behind. The pain of grief is born from the intensity of that love, from how deeply we cared, and from the way that love is now forced to exist without its intended recipient. In some ways, grief is love in its purest, most vulnerable form. The writer Janie Anderson said grief is just love with nowhere to go. So it lingers in the pain, in the longing, in the tears that fall when you remember them. But within that, there is a beauty. Grief is proof that we were capable of loving someone so profoundly that their absence shakes us to the core. It's proof that they mattered, that their life had an impact, that their memory continues to hold space in our hearts. So while grief can feel uncomfortable, it also is a testament to the love that was and still is. That love doesn't die, it remains forever intertwined with our sorrow. Grief is the heart's way of saying, I will never forget you. It's love, enduring, unbreakable, and eternal. Despite the pain, I had to live with that. I had to accept that. I had to grasp that concept. I had to try to move now in that mindset. Otherwise, grief would have destroyed me. Living with multiple sclerosis, I already had challenges. But after my son passed, it was like my body responded to the grief. My symptoms got worse. The stress was overwhelming. There were days when I could barely get out of bed, not just because I was mourning, but because my body was physically breaking down under the weight of it all. Grief affects everything, your mind, your heart, and yes, your body. I had to come to terms with that, and I had to realize that if I didn't take care of myself, if I didn't give myself space to heal, both physically and emotionally, then I wouldn't make it. My son wouldn't want that. He wouldn't want me to give up. So I had to learn to fight again, even when I didn't feel like I had anything left to give. So how do you move forward when your heart is shattered? How do you keep living when a part of you is gone? It's not easy, but I've learned a few things along the way. I've learned that healing is a process. It's not linear. Some days you're okay. Other days you're not. I mean, that's all right. It's all right. For me, my faith has been a lifeline. I've had to lean on God in ways I never imagined. I have had to cry out in the middle of the night, asking why, wondering how I'm supposed to carry on. But through it all, I felt his presence. Even in the darkest moments, I know I'm not alone. And neither are you. If you're walking through grief right now, I want you to know that God sees you. I've seen so many of my friends deal with losses recently, some new, some not so new. And trust me, I understand. Trust me when I tell you, I now understand. Whether it was 4 years ago or 4 weeks ago, I can unfortunately now say, I get it. But I wanted to say to you that God hears your cries. He is with you even when it feels like no one else is. I've also found strength in remembering my son, saying his name, sharing his story, keeping his memory alive. That's how I cope. I let myself feel the pain, but I also remind myself of the joy he brought into my life and everybody's life that he touched. Because that joy, that love is something that grief can never take away from me. I want to thank you for being here with me today, for allowing me to share this part of my journey with you. Grief is a heavy topic, but it's something so many of us face. And I've seen so many lately posting about loss. And if I can leave with you anything, it's this. You don't have to do it alone. There's no shame in reaching out and asking for help and admitting that you're not okay. That's where healing begins. In some of my upcoming episodes, I'll be talking more about my experience with MS, about living with chronic illness and finding strength even when you feel weak. But today I just wanted to sit in this space of grief to honor the journey we're on. So until next time, take care of yourselves. Remember, it's okay to have good days and bad days. And on those bad days, know that you are never alone.